6 months earlier, on a Sunday night at my in-laws' house outside Dallas, Fort Worth, I was the one helping build the family trip they would later use to humiliate me. And if you have ever been the dependable one in a family, you already know how dangerous that can be. That night felt normal in the way family dinners are supposed to feel. Diane had made one of her big Sunday meals, the kind where every dish takes up too much room on the table, and nobody stops talking long enough to finish a sentence. Frank was at the head of the table, quiet but content. Ethan sat beside me. Melissa and Jason were across from us. Tyler was at the far end with Brianna. Chloe kept pretending not to listen while listening to everything, and Noah was busy deciding which side dish he wanted more of. We were talking about school and work and nothing that mattered when Melissa set down her glass and said that next year would be Diane and Frank's 50th wedding anniversary, and that maybe for once, we should do something bigger than dinner at a restaurant. Diane gave that modest little smile she liked to wear when she wanted praise without asking for it and said it did not have to be a whole thing, but Ethan agreed with Melissa right away. 50 years was a big deal, he said. It should feel special. I leaned in almost without thinking. I said a beach trip could actually work if we started early enough. Somewhere family-friendly but still nice. Somewhere the kids would have enough to do and the adults could breathe. When I suggested Destin, Florida, the whole table shifted. A beach house, I said. Enough bedrooms for everyone. Maybe a private pool. Maybe walking distance to the water so we would not spend all week hauling chairs and towels back and forth. Frank looked up first. He did not say much, but his face changed. Melissa loved the idea immediately. Jason asked what it would cost. Tyler joked that if we planned far enough ahead, he might still be dating the same person by then, and everybody laughed. I was already doing numbers in my head by the time Ethan touched my back and said I was the one who could make something like that happen because I was organized, good with money. And always the person who kept everybody on track. At the time that felt like appreciation. By the end of dinner I had the destination, the rough budget, and the job nobody else had stepped forward to take. Over the next several months the trip stopped being a nice family idea and became something I was carrying almost by myself. Most nights after work, once the kitchen was clean and Noah had finished asking for help with homework and Chloe had gone back upstairs, I would sit in the little home office off the den and compare properties in Destin on my laptop. I checked bedroom counts, beach access cancellation, policies, parking, cleaning fees, seasonal rates, and whether the layouts made sense for grandparents, teenagers, younger kids, and Tyler, who treated planning like it was a weather pattern instead of something a person had to do. I built a spreadsheet, then a better spreadsheet, then another one that broke costs down by household so nobody would feel blindsided later. I started a family group chat for the anniversary trip and kept everybody updated every few weeks. Melissa replied fast and enthusiastically. Jason chimed in when money came up. Diane sent grateful messages that sounded touched but a little formal, the way she always sounded when I was being useful. Tyler answered in bursts, usually late and usually with a joke, but enough to show he was still in. Ethan hardly ever wrote in the chat. He said he did not need to because we lived in the same house and at the time that sounded reasonable enough. When the booking deadline got close and the best beach house was about to disappear, I called the property manager, myself confirmed the terms, checked the guest policy, and booked the house in my own name so we would keep the rate. Ethan gave me his share after I reminded him, but the truth was that most of the money going into that trip came from my salary and the work bonuses I had been quietly saving for months. I tracked every payment. I kept every confirmation email. I updated everybody. Like this was something we were all building together. And that is the part that still gets me. The person everyone trusts to hold things together is often the easiest person to exploit because people confuse reliability with infinite tolerance. By the time the booking confirmation landed in my inbox, the trip was real. It was paid into. It was planned. And whether anyone said it out loud or not, it had become mine emotionally in a way the others had not earned. 3 months before the trip, the first changes were small enough that I kept talking myself out of what I was seeing. Ethan had always been home a little after 7 unless something at work had gone sideways. Then that shifted. One night he walked in closer to 8. A few days later, it was almost 9. Every time he had a reason ready before I even asked. A client problem. A late meeting. Something due first thing in the morning. He had worked in consulting long enough that none of that sounded impossible, and I wanted to be fair. I told myself it was probably just a rough stretch at work. Maybe he was even trying to stay ahead of expenses before the trip. But over the next few weeks it was not just the timing that felt off. It was the way he came into the house distracted, like only part of him had actually arrived. It was how he sometimes turned his phone face down when I entered a room or silenced it without checking the screen. It was the little drop in his energy whenever I mentioned the beach house room assignments or the next planning step. Then one Saturday afternoon while he was out and I was in the study looking for a document I had printed, his phone lit up on the desk beside me. I was not trying to snoop. I only glanced because the screen flashed so brightly in the quiet room. What I saw made me stop. It was a group notification, but not from the family trip chat I had created. The title looked related close enough to make my stomach tighten, but it was not the same thread. I stood there with the paper in one hand and that cold little feeling moving under my ribs. It was not proof. Not yet. But it changed the way I heard every vague answer after that, every delayed reply, every family conversation where people suddenly seemed just a little too careful around me. About a month before the trip we were back at Diane and Frank's house on a Sunday afternoon, and I walked in expecting to finish the practical parts because that was the point we had reached. The beach house was booked. The money had been tracked for months. It was time to lock in flights and stop treating the trip like some loose family idea. Dinner started normally enough, but the mood at the table shifted the second I brought up airfare. I told them I had found a good window and that if we booked that night we could save a real amount before prices jumped again. Melissa asked what time the flights would leave, but there was something strained in the question, like she was filling space more than asking for information. I pulled up the options and said there was a morning flight that made the most sense for getting everybody into Destin without wasting the first day. Ethan looked at the screen, then said I should go ahead and book mine and the kids' tickets first. I turned to him and just stared for a beat. What about his ticket? He cleared his throat and said there was a chance he might have to travel for work and join us a day later. Nothing definite yet. Just something he was waiting to hear back on. The excuse came too fast and landed too weakly. I looked around the table. Melissa and Jason suddenly had their own complications. Maybe they were thinking of driving. Maybe it would be easier with the kids. Tyler shrugged and said he was still figuring things out. Diane smiled in that tight little way people do when they want a conversation to end without actually ending it. Frank barely spoke. The whole room had that terrible feeling of people acting normal too carefully. That night back at home, I asked Ethan directly what was going on because his family had not sounded uncertain. They had sounded rehearsed. He slipped into that calm tone he used whenever he wanted a problem to disappear without solving it. He said I was reading too much into a messy family conversation, that everyone was just bad at planning, that work had him distracted, that the trip was still happening. Then he kissed my forehead, moved on, and left me standing there with the one thing I could no longer talk myself out of. Whatever this was, it was not random. 2 weeks before the trip on a Tuesday afternoon, the truth reached me in the most humiliating way possible. Not from Ethan. Not from Diane. Not even from Melissa. It came by accident in public from someone who thought I already knew. I had taken the day off to handle last-minute errands around Dallas-Fort Worth, the kind of practical things that always seemed to land on me when a family trip got close. I was leaving a store with sunscreen, travel-sized toiletries, and a few things Chloe had asked for when I heard someone call my name near the parking lot. It was Rachel Moreno, one of Melissa's close friends, carrying a shopping bag and smiling like this was just a lucky little coincidence. We exchanged the usual quick pleasantries, and then Rachel said she was honestly a little jealous about the Destin trip because Melissa had been talking about it so much. I smiled automatically and said it had taken forever to organize, but at least it was finally coming together. Rachel nodded, then said almost casually that she had thought the whole point was that it was only for direct family, which was why she understood not being included herself. I stared at her for half a beat before asking what she meant. Her face changed immediately. First confusion, then alarm, like she had stepped on something sharp without seeing it. She said Melissa had told her the trip was meant to be for blood family, only that it would just be Diane and Frank, their children and the grandkids. And that I had supposedly agreed because it would make the week simpler and more intimate. She even said Melissa had made it sound like I was the one who framed it that way. That was the moment the ground gave out under me. Not because I believed Rachel over my own life, but because Rachel clearly believed she was repeating something already settled. There is something especially cruel about being excluded in private and then learning the people who did it have already started explaining your absence to the outside world. I ended the conversation without making a scene, but once I got into my car and shut the door, I just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel, replaying every vague answer. Every strange look, every delayed reply from the past month. I was done guessing. If there had been a second version of this trip all along, I was going to find out exactly how far it went. I did not drive home right away after that conversation. I stayed parked in the lot with the engine off and my phone in my hand, forcing myself to do the one thing that mattered. Stop spiraling and start confirming facts. The first call I made was to the property manager in Destin. I gave my name, the reservation dates, and the address of the beach house, keeping my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. The woman on the other end pulled up the booking and confirmed that everything was fully paid and active. I asked who was authorized to make changes. The answer came back simple and clean. Only me. No additional names had been added. No alternate contact had been approved. No one else had authority over the reservation. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there in silence for a few seconds. That detail mattered more than anything else. Whatever Ethan and his family had planned, they were moving toward a trip they did not actually control. I drove home before the kids got back, made dinner, answered Chloe's question about whether I had bought the sunscreen, and moved through the evening like someone walking over thin ice without letting anyone hear it crack. Ethan came in late again, kissed me on the cheek, talked about work in that flat, distracted way he had developed over the past month, and never once noticed that something in me had already changed. That night, after the house finally went quiet and he was asleep beside me, I picked up his phone and opened the thread I already knew had to exist. It was there. A second family group chat with everyone in it except me. I scrolled through weeks of messages and watched the full shape of the betrayal come into focus. Melissa asking when they were finally going to tell me I was staying behind. Diane saying she felt bad about it. Tyler mostly staying out of it but never objecting. Jason asking whether I would cancel the trip if I found out. And Ethan answering in ways that hurt more than anything Melissa had said. He agreed that it would be easier without me there. He said I had become controlling about everything. He said I did not need to know until the last minute because once the house was paid, what was I really going to do? I had to put the phone down for a second because my hands were shaking so hard. The humiliation was still there, the hurt was still there, but now it had edges. Now it had proof. And once a lie becomes evidence, it stops being a marriage problem and becomes a decision. Over the next 2 days, I stopped thinking like a hurt wife and started thinking like a woman who needed every fact documented before the next move. The morning after I found the messages, once Ethan had left for work and the kids were out of the house, I drove to Angela Brooks's office in Dallas-Fort Worth with screenshots, bank records, booking emails, and a timeline already organized in a folder. Angela had known me long enough to understand that if I had arranged the evidence this carefully, the marriage was already in deeper trouble than whatever words I first used to describe it. I walked her through the full sequence, starting with the anniversary dinner, then the Destin planning the payments, Rachel's accidental reveal, the property manager call, and finally the messages on Ethan's phone. She barely interrupted. When I finished, she told me 2 things that mattered immediately. First, I needed to preserve every piece of evidence and separate my future income carefully without doing anything reckless that could hurt me later. Second, the beach house reservation was under my name, controlled through my booking authority, and still mine to manage. That did not undo the humiliation, but it gave the humiliation somewhere to go. So that same afternoon I set up a separate account for my incoming pay going forward, secured copies of the payment trail, showing how much of the trip money had come from my salary and bonuses, and saved every screenshot in more than one place. Then I called the property manager back from my car and updated the guest list. Ethan's family came off. My real family went on. Emily. My mother Elena. Nicole. Vanessa. Saying their names out loud felt almost unreal, not because they were uncertain but because they came with something I had not felt in days. Relief. Later that evening, after the house had settled down, I started making the actual invitations, 1 call at a time from the home office, speaking softly so the kids would not hear too much and Ethan would not hear anything. This is the difference people miss. A woman can be heartbroken and still become very precise. By the end of the second day, I had a plan that was legal, documented, and devastatingly simple. The only thing left was making sure Ethan and his family kept believing I was still exactly where they wanted me. In the dark. That Friday morning in the kitchen of our house outside Dallas-Fort Worth, Ethan finally delivered the lie I had already seen coming. He came downstairs wearing the expression of a man preparing to announce something unfortunate but unavoidable, poured coffee, and said a client issue had exploded in New York. He would have to fly out over the weekend and might miss the start of the Destin trip. The timing he said was terrible, but there was nothing he could do. Then he moved to the part that mattered. The kids should still go with Diane and Frank, he said. His family could take them ahead and I could stay behind since somebody needed to keep an eye on the house until he figured out his travel situation. I looked at him, kept my face calm and acted like I was processing an inconvenience instead of an insult. I asked a few practical questions, just enough to seem unsettled but not suspicious. He relaxed the second I did not push. That was the first sign the performance was working. Over the next 2 days I kept playing my role. I helped Chloe and Noah pack. I folded swimsuits, checked chargers, and reminded Noah not to forget the medication he always tossed into bags at the last second. Chloe, though, was too perceptive to miss the tension. Late Saturday evening, while I was setting aside travel-size sunscreen in the upstairs hall, she asked why none of this felt normal if it was supposed to be a family vacation. I gave her the gentlest answer I could without lying more than necessary. I said adults sometimes made messy decisions and that what mattered right now was that she stay close to Noah and call me if she needed anything. By Sunday afternoon the house had that strange stillness that comes right before a departure. Diane pulled into the driveway to collect the kids, stepped out of the car already looking nervous and avoided my eyes the moment she came up the walk. I asked her quietly and directly why everybody had chosen pretending over honesty. She folded almost at once. She did not confess everything, but she said enough. Melissa had been against me going for a while. Ethan had gone along with it. They all thought it would be easier this way. I let the words land without giving anything back. Then I hugged Chloe and Noah, watched Diane drive them away, and stood in the driveway just long enough to make sure Ethan's family left Texas believing the trap had worked exactly as planned. That Sunday evening, once Diane had already driven off with Chloe and Noah and there was no realistic way for Ethan's family to turn around without admitting what they had done, I finally moved. I went back inside the house, closed the front door, and sat at the kitchen counter for one steadying breath before opening the family trip chat I had created months earlier. The same one I had kept alive with budgets, updates, reminders, and every ounce of labor they had been so happy to let me provide. My message was simple and devastating. I said I hoped everyone had a safe drive to Florida, but there had been a change to the Destin reservation. Since the beach house was booked in my name, paid largely with my money, and controlled through my authorization, I had updated the guest list. The house would now be used by the people I actually wanted there. Then I added the part that mattered most. Ethan was not in New York. I knew exactly what they had planned. And when he came back, the divorce papers would be waiting. By the time the phones started lighting up, Emily was already pulling into the driveway. I did not answer a single call. I grabbed my bag, locked the house, and left for the airport with Emily. My mother, Elena, Nicole, and Vanessa met us near the terminal with the kind of immediate loyalty that asks questions later and shows up first. Early the next day, while we were in the air, heading toward Florida, Ethan's side of the family was still driving east, expecting to arrive in Destin and walk straight into the beach house I had spent months securing. Instead, what reached me later through voice messages, missed calls, and Chloe's shaken account was chaos. When Ethan, Diane, Melissa, Jason, Tyler, and the kids finally reached the property after the long drive, the manager informed them that they were not on the approved guest list and could not be given access. Ethan argued. Diane cried. Melissa apparently tried outrage, as if enough volume could rewrite a booking record. None of it changed the fact that the house they thought they had stolen was no longer theirs to enter. There is a particular kind of justice in watching someone lose access to the comfort they had already started spending in their head. By the time I arrived in, Destin checked in properly, and walked into that cool, bright house overlooking the Gulf with my real family beside me. Ethan's family was scrambling for last-minute rooms at much higher prices, split between worse options and living through the public embarrassment they had planned so casually for me. During the trip itself, the moment that stayed with me was not the beach house or the pool or even the relief of finally being somewhere beautiful without having to earn my place there. It was the phone call with Chloe. I stepped out onto the back patio in Destin early on the second morning while the others were still inside making coffee and called to check on the kids. Chloe answered, sounding older than 15 for a few quiet seconds. She told me everybody on Ethan's side was angry, embarrassed, and blaming each other, but that she and Noah were okay. Then she said something that settled deeper than I expected. She said she knew this had not been some misunderstanding because she had watched the adults act strange for weeks and had heard enough after they got to Florida to understand what they had tried to do. Children always know more than the adults around them want to believe. I told her I loved her, told her to stay close to Noah, and promised that when we got home things would not stay half hidden anymore. Back in Dallas-Fort Worth a few days later, Ethan was already in the house when I returned. He tried the same soft, reasonable tone he had used all month and called the whole thing a mistake, a mess that had gotten out of hand, something his family had pushed too far. I did not argue in circles. I put the screenshots, payment records and Angela's paperwork in front of him, and told him the marriage was over. In the months that followed, the lie collapsed completely. The divorce moved forward. The children's primary home stayed with me. The house remained mine. Melissa reached out once and admitted what jealousy had done to her, but by then the confession changed nothing. Ethan ended up exactly where people like him usually do after they mistake loyalty for permanence. Full of regret, and too late to matter. What stayed with me instead was something steadier. The beach house in Destin no longer lived in my memory as the place where I was excluded. It became the place where I finally stopped begging to be chosen by people who had already decided I was useful, not loved. A few months later, when I looked at photos from that trip with Emily, my mother Nicole, Vanessa and the rest of the people who had shown up without hesitation, the feeling that came back was not revenge. It was peace. I let that feeling sit for a while because it had taken me too long to understand that peace is what is left when you stop offering yourself to people who only value your effort. So here is the question I cannot stop thinking about. If the people closest to you made their lives easier by asking you to stay quiet, stay useful, and stay left out, how long would it take before you chose yourself instead?